Hi, I'm Carys.
And I'm Gary Young.
And this is our new podcast, Over the Top and Under the Radar.
Each week, we concentrate on a couple of stories that we think the media have gone over the top on. And then we cover a couple of stories that we think have gone under the radar.
And if you want to stay in touch with us and the podcast community, sign up to our newsletter at overunderpod.com.
This is Over the Top, Under the Radar.
Gary, how you doing?
Not too bad. Yeah, I was half term last week, so there was that, in which my 11-year-old, among other things, told me, "Listen, Dad, you're no spring onion," which I thought was a pretty good one. And when I said, it's spring chicken, and she said, that doesn't make any sense either, which is true. So, yeah.
You're no spring onion.
No spring onion.
Was that, had you done something to prompt that?
I'd said that I could kind of karate kick to the level of her head. Yeah. So, I had it coming. It's been a week. Diane Abbott is now going to stand, which is interesting. Among other things, it shows to Labour in a way that they needed to learn that she and what she represents is as important to them, maybe even more so than what they do for her or whoever. They think black people got nowhere else to go, that we are dispensable. I hope they learned a lesson there.
In that vein of people we had talked about in previous episodes of the podcast, in the last few days, Faiza Shaheen has announced that she's resigned from the Labour Party and will be standing to be the MP for Chingford and Woodford Green, but as an independent candidate.
I do understand why she's done that. I feel for her because they're going to come for her. Labour, by deselecting her and flying in someone from Brent, she probably got an Uber. She probably didn't fly.
Yeah, probably an Uber.
They've already put that seat at risk.
Yeah, so I think, Faiza's a friend. So mostly the last week or so have just been me being concerned for a friend who's already was pushing herself really hard, campaigning during a general election with a small baby. She has been pretty systematically bullied since she was reselected as the Labour candidate, culminating in the horrible Zoom call that I think some of the recording of it, has leaked. But it's been a pretty steady campaign against her. And so I am a Labour Party member and continue to be a Labour Party member. But I really think for Faiza, or for anyone who's experienced horrible bullying and mistreatment, the thing you have the right to do is to be the architect of what happens next. And for Faiza, that didn't involve staying and fighting in the Labour Party. And she's written a statement about that and about her decision. And to replace her with someone who isn't from the area, that is another woman of colour.
They think we won't know.
It just feels...
They just get the colour chart up. They think, that'll do.
Same shade.
But also this week, there were the results of the South African election. And we did talk about South Africa last week. The ANC, as predicted, went significantly below 50%. The big winners were MK, which is Jacob Zuma's party.
Yeah, his party.
Jacob Zuma, who's a former president and who's frankly become quite Trumpy. He's had some run-ins with the law. He's contesting the results, saying that he actually won by a landslide. So there's MK. There's the EFF, which are quite a hard line. They're not just hard left, and they're described as Marxist. I would call them Stalinist, actually. I'm happy to be wrong. They
the big news is that because, as you predicted, the ANC are no longer the majority, they have to form a coalition, right? That's the next thing.
And so that they can either form with MK. There's a real problem there because Jacob Zuma's precondition for any kind of coalition is that they get rid of Cyril Ramaphosa. So why would he do that? Yeah. Frankly, I also think they are incredibly unstable as a kind of political movement. There's EFF, which is, I described, hard left, or they can go with the DA, which is primarily representing White people,
right? That's the white
they
people
want to
party.
row back on affirmative action. They want to pretend that apartheid's over, everything's moved on. There was no legacy. Let's just let's just have done with it. And so they have quite a difficult choice. I would go with the EFF. None of them are particularly ideal, but I do think that an acceleration of the redistribution agenda is what is needed. I think that's why they've lost. So, Carys, what's your over the top?
So my over the top is Rupert Murdoch's wedding. Fifth wedding, Rupert, 93. Elena Zukova, 67.
Spring onion. She's a spring onion.
And I should say, Gary, I bloody love a wedding. I love a wedding. It's just, love, romance. You get to dress up, canapes. Oh.
I know. Everybody's up for it.
Yeah, everybody's up for it. But also
dad dancing,
bit of Motown, intergenerational fun. Also, if you're British, weddings are sort of one of 3 times when you're allowed to show genuine emotion.
What are the other two?
Other is funeral or football match. You can quote a funeral, a wedding, or a football match. If people listening believe there are other acceptable times for British people to cry, please do tell me. But yeah, my sense is that otherwise we've got to keep a stiff upper lip. But I'm over Rupert Murdoch's wedding, partly because I do not think this wedding needed the amount of coverage that it had. Every single newspaper, picture story. But also, I've just got this theory that the succession effect has made us sort of start treating the Murdochs like this soapy family. And we're not actually talking about their business interests and the very pernicious effect that they have on our politics in America, politics in Australia, multiple countries in the world. So testing the theory with you, Gary, I'm over Rupert's wedding and I want to talk more about News Corp and Fox.
See, I think that honestly, most people don't give a crap about the Murdochs, and that he's been this kind of towering figure. He's been around for a long time. I think there'll be some people who are like, oh God, is he still alive? Kind of thing. He's worn us out a little bit.
Yeah, but I mean, it was still FT, Guardian, all the newspapers had it on Monday. But I think the thing that freaks me out more is we've got this blanket coverage of the wedding, but in the last 12 months, there has been quite a lot of big stuff happening in his companies. We haven't spoken as much about that. So first of all, which you may have seen, Rupert has finally stepped back and announced his successor, Lachlan Murdoch, a man who multiple people say is more right-wing than his father. Rebecca Brooks is back, those of you who remember phone hacking from 10 years ago. Also, the other big thing that happened, I think just over a year ago now, was the Dominion lawsuit where Fox News paid just under $800 million to one of the companies making voting software because at the last US presidential election, Fox News spread a load of misinformation and fake news saying that the election result wasn't legitimate. We're coming into a year of elections. Occasionally CNN beats it, but Fox News, for about a decade has been the biggest force in cable TV news in America. This family, these companies, have so much influence over our politics, and we're getting more attention on who he's marrying. Lachlan and James Murdoch have fallen out because James believes in climate change and Lachlan's on the fence. And actually, this man, and by extension his family, have built this terrifying media empire that, despite the phone hacking scandal 10 years ago, is still having a pretty pernicious influence on our politics. But I just think, we're not talking enough about it. You lived in America for quite a long time. I'm slightly terrified about what Fox are going to do in November.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you. When it came to the 2020 election, actually Fox was the first to call Arizona for Biden. And it actually kind of right-wingers were incredibly angry with it. Undue influence is undue influence, whether it's for your team or not. And one of the weirder things about American elections is that the results are called by networks and by things like AP or whatever. You don't get that moment where the kind of mayor or the governor stands up and tells you what the result is. And so an outlet like Fox calling Arizona when it wasn't settled for a couple of days after was quite a big deal. And my understanding is that Murdoch soured on Trump pretty quickly, but his network didn't. There are these fissures in the right, and I actually think he, for all of the ways in which he's awful and for all of the ways in which his network created the conditions for Trump, I'm not sure that Trump would be his favored guy.
So I think that's fair. And, you know, those fissures are real. And for those who aren't deep in Fox News, it was Roger Ailes, who was the first person who ran the network that was really in bed with Trump and crafted the political project of Fox, although obviously reporting into Rupert Murdoch. I think the interesting thing about the Arizona call that Fox News made was that it was a moment where this audience and this base that powers the Murdoch empire, like Fox News makes the Murdochs a lot of money. It's how they can pay out phone hacking fines. The Arizona call was one that they were punished for by their audience. So we're in this situation where you're right. The right isn't homogenous. Rupert Murdoch, I don't think, is best pals with Donald Trump, although I think he likes to back a winner. But they've now built up a news channel that isn't a news channel, doesn't report news, that if it says something that's true that its audience doesn't like, it feels the need to row back. It is really worth looking into that court case because the extent to which Rupert and Lachlan Murdoch are hands-on with the editorial content of Fox News, but also the extent to which the views of the audience and this kind of MAGA crew that are a big chunk of Fox News then shape how Fox is covering politics is pretty terrifying. And remember that just shy of $800 million Dominion settlement was paid out so that this wouldn't all play out in court. So this is just the stuff that we saw. So I think there's a real risk around the legitimacy of this US election. And then I think, honestly, Murdoch, News Corp still have a huge amount of influence over British politics and UK politics. We haven't actually seen any meaningful media reform that prevents this man, having so much political influence in the UK, Australia, and the US.
And we don't actually also talk enough, I think, about what that means democratically. So I remember reading an account of David Cameron during the Brexit vote, suddenly having this situation where he had to deal with the hostile media, and he'd just never done it before because he's a Tory. I also wonder, Rupert is getting on, if there can be conversations about whether Joe Biden can run a country. There can be conversations about the extent to which he, at 93, can meaningfully be hands-on. My sense is that Lachlan is not as good, not as sharp, not as bold. There was a force of will in these kind of developments with Murdoch, a kind of, he would overpay for things. Sometimes it would work out. Sometimes, like MySpace, it didn't work out. I hope that we are coming towards the end of this reign and monopoly.
My fear is it gets worse with someone he's kind of the OG Nepo baby, right? These kids were brought up, with the newspaper. They talk about having the newspapers at breakfast and sort of talking over it. Very Succession style. They're given the keys to the kingdom and they can run the world. So I'm over Rupert's wedding. I'm not over News Corp and Fox News. I'm sure him and Elena will be very happy, but I don't want to hear about their marriage. I want to hear about the company.
Yeah. I kind of wish the couple well and the business ill.
Yeah. Okay. That's so nice.
I'm not going to get off on anybody being miserable, even though he makes everybody miserable or makes lots of people miserable. But I'm no more interested in his marriage than he is in mine, really. My over, and this moves quite neatly on, is Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage just last week said he wasn't going to stand, went on a bunch of shows, including Question Time, said he wasn't going to stand, that he was out of politics, that he was moving on. And then this week he said he was going to stand. He's going to stand as a candidate in Clacton, which has elected a UKIP candidate before. Now they're called Reform. It's not even a party. It's a business. he didn't have to go through any kind of election campaign because he runs a business. So he just became the leader. So there's your democracy for you, and selected himself to stand in Clacton. So Keir Starmer's got a little bit of a way to go before he gets there, although he's working at it. And
Keir might be taking tips. Create company, make self chairman of company.
Yes, give self country. Here's the thing for me about Nigel Farage, that first of all, the way that this has been dealt with in other podcasts and articles is like, will this hurt Labour? Will this hurt the Tories? Who's he going to take votes from? I just think that's entirely the wrong way to look at it. I know that there's an election coming up, and the truth is that we don't know. But for me, the problem is not what does this mean for Labour and Tories? What does this mean for black and brown people in this country? What does this mean for xenophobia and racism in this country? Because one of the reasons why Farage has been able to soar in the way that he has, even though, in my opinion, he's a talentless prick, and he...
he's a good media performer, Gary. I'll give him that.
Well, so's Barney the dinosaur. He has stood for election 7 times. He's still, if you add all of the votes that he got those 7 times, he still got less votes than Diane Abbott got in one election in 2019 when the swing was away from Labour. Like, he's not that talented electorally, certainly. Paradoxically, the only time when him and his parties, and it's been UKIP, it's been Brexit, now it's Reform, have done well is in European elections, which he opposes.
He opposes Europe. He's in favour of the expenses. He's in favour of the expenses,
and he got caught out on the expenses. My issue here is I think he gets 2 free rides that are unforgivable. The media treat him like a kind of, garrulous, sort of slightly drunk uncle at a barbecue. Like he's good for a quote, and he's not. Fascism is once again a mainstream ideology in Europe, and he comes through that tradition, and he identifies with those like Le Pen and Orbán and Trump and others who identify with that tradition. They don't say to him, right, you want net zero immigration. Who is going to staff our care homes? Who is going to staff the NHS? My mum came to this country to work for the NHS. The NHS from Barbados, they paid her flight. They were that desperate. And you know who was the head of the NHS at the time? Who was the health secretary at the time during the restructuring when they sent for my mum? Enoch Powell. And you know who loved Enoch Powell? Nigel Farage, who said, his speech made an awful lot of sense. So he's not funny. He's not particularly entertaining. He's quite dangerous, and he perpetually misinformed. So he's not held up to a sufficiently rigorous standard. And they say things like, but isn't that divisive? As opposed to, that is divisive, don't you think?
Well, I think there are 2 things on that. Like, one is when he initially said he wasn't standing, part of the reason was that he was too busy helping out on Donald Trump's campaign. And I believe this Friday he's hosting a London fundraiser with Holly Valance, bizarrely, from Neighbours. And I think the other thing that I was thinking about this when he, his face popped up on Channel 4 News. And I do think he's a strong media performer, especially having sat through an hour-long debate with the leaders of the 2 main political parties. He's got that sort of public schoolboy confidence. And make no mistake, he is a public schoolboy, despite raging against elites. But I think the thing that freaks me out about Nigel Farage is there's this political appeasement of him that happens. I'd be interested in your thoughts on it, because it's the exact opposite of like what we've seen with the left of the Labour Party, which is like Keir Starmer can't go far enough to like beat up on the left, expel the left. But Nigel Farage, ever since he left the Tories in the early 90s and popped up as this Eurosceptic figure, has been consistently like appeased, ingratiated, indulged by the Tory party over years. Nigel Farage was this figure, that we arguably had the Brexit referendum because the Tories were so terrified about UKIP and Farage. And it is like other forms of appeasement. It's never enough. And so now my fear about him turning up to lead reform, which was the Brexit Party, which was UKIP, which was whatever it is. Like, the Tories' response will be to appease him. And I think this Labour Party's response will also be to appease him. So then we've got a situation where, like, everyone's going to be trying to outdo themselves to sound as tough on immigration as Nigel Farage. So, like, to be Islamophobic and, like, dog whistle racist. And yeah, I don't know how he does it, Gary, because as you say, like, he doesn't actually win elections, but he does turn up like a bad smell and make everyone right wing.
And it's curious because there isn't a lot of room to the Tory right? People keep saying, oh, he says things that other people are thinking, but they won't say, which is, first of all, pretty kind of sinister notion. But also, what do they want? They're already chartering flights to fly people to Rwanda. What do they want to shoot the plane down as well? Do you know what I mean? What are people thinking? And a lot of what people do think is actually just factually wrong. So British people think there are twice as many immigrants in Britain as there are. They think there are about 4 times as many Muslims in Britain as they are. This is according to a YouGov poll from a few years ago. And a lot of that comes around people like Farage. And what they don't want to do is have a meaningful conversation about the needs of a country with an aging population and a diversifying economy. When, if you're talking about the NHS, for example, like I said, it couldn't have existed without migrant labour. One of the problems with the NHS in terms of beds is that there are old people that they can't get into care homes because there isn't the labour in care homes. That labour is coming from elsewhere. Our university system is underfunded and utterly dependent on the overpaying that foreign students do. In a range of ways, this country is completely addicted to migrants, migration, and migrant labour. Not all of it in a good way. And they don't want to deal with that. So then they blame, particularly after the financial crisis, you would have thought that it was refugees and asylum seekers who were dealing in, credit default swaps and all the rest of it and crashed the economy. And it wasn't.
I mean, it's worse than that though, isn't it, Gary? Because Nigel Farage made his life's mission our exit from the European Union. And we were told, there were big numbers on the side of buses, we were told that the immigration problem would be solved by Brexit. We have Brexited, and like a lot of focus is on small boats, rightly so. It is absolutely horrific, the conditions that people are crossing the channel in. Actually, net migration is at a record high, and that's non-EU migration because, as you said, we need immigrants. Like, the economy needs immigrants, society needs immigrants. And so we're in this situation where, like, he should have this hung around his neck. Like, he wanged on about Brexit for however many bloody years. We got Brexit. Economy's down the toilet. Migration, which was sort of, not even codedly, we were told there's all these people coming and next there'll be Turkish people coming and we need to get out of the European Union. And we got out and immigration went up. You have to sort of respect the grift and the hustle of this like serial liar who has popped back into our politics years on from the Brexit boat being like, I am the solution to British society's problems. And it's like, you are the problem. You have been the problem.
And no one's going to say to him, where do these people on these boats, where do many of them come from? Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, areas that we've destabilized or we've bombed. What is our responsibility to this world and the chaos that we've made? What are our needs as a country with an aging population? They're not going to do that. And it's scary because when these people come out, as he does, or when Boris writes his thing about people in looking like letterboxes, people get attacked. Violence happens. It actually affects people's daily lives. It's like arsenic in the water supply of the political culture because it goes everywhere and everybody kind of ends up sick. There's going to be no moral intervention at all. It just doesn't seem to have a consequence. It's like Trump. And he kind of comes out and he says, I've changed my mind. It's not always a sign of weakness, And it's like,
yeah, he's just so bloody confident, and he doesn't mince his words. And he's like, yeah, change my mind. People can change their mind. I mean, obviously what he's peddling is toxic and horrible, and it's not for people like me. He's made it pretty clear it's not for people with our skin color. But like, I get it when everyone else is sort of just like stumbling over technocratic talking points and not really saying anything real or true. I get the appeal, but it is fucking terrifying. Just a bit of a twat, isn't he?
He is a talentless prick.
And now it's time for a break. So my under the radar for this week is public opinion on climate change. And I'm going to be honest, I had to speak to a few friends. I believe in climate change. It is happening, but I am not a natural environmentalist. It isn't the thing that got me interested in politics. So I had to sort of double check a couple of facts. But the thing that struck me that I only saw picked up in one newspaper is that there's this gap between what British people think about climate change and what should be done about climate change and what MPs think. So just the headline stat that grabbed me was 62% of British people think we should reduce our use of fossil fuels and increase our use of renewable energy. YouGov poll for the Energy and Climate Change Intelligence Unit. Majority of people are like, let's cut back on fossil fuels. Let's ramp up the renewable energy. Feels sensible. 48% of MPs think we should do that. And obviously, once you take it to Tory MPs, that figure is 28%. The reason I think this is under the radar and it's shame it doesn't get talked about more is this is kind of a good news story. We're in a really good position. Climate change isn't a polarizing issue in the UK. Most people in the UK believe climate change is happening and we should do something about it. And this study that came out this week showed that 75% of the public would back a new onshore wind farm in their area. We've got this sort of open goal where we don't all agree on everything in the UK, but we do agree climate change is happening. We broadly agree on what we should do to tackle it. But not only do MPs have less progressive views on climate, they are underestimating their voters and their constituents. What we've actually seen is a consistent rowing back on climate commitments from both parties. So Rishi Sunak in September of last year had a big row back on net zero commitments. Labour's, I think it started as a £28 billion energy climate commitment 2 years ago, has been rowed back. And in February of this year, it was kind of shrunk even further. It's one of these issues of disconnect between most people in the country and then political elites, and all these people who are putting their faces on leaflets, and we're going to be hearing from endlessly for the next 4 weeks, like they want to lead and yet they're not showing leadership on climate change.
See, I don't know that that's true, Carys. They want to get elected. I don't know that they do want to lead. Actually, quite often they want to follow. They want to follow whatever the posters say, whatever the lobbyists say, whatever. I don't see a whole lot of leadership from these people. You know, if you're asked, what do you think of sending planes to Rwanda, and your answer is, well, it won't work. That's not leadership. It's a form of cowardice. You know it's wrong, but you're not going to say anything. There are people who stand for election and who stand for more than office, and they do want to lead. Sadly, I don't think most of them do want to lead.
Yeah, and I actually think it's been horrible to see them demonized in the interests of the culture war by some of the characters we discussed in today's episode. But I actually think that climate activists have been some of the most inspiring grassroots and direct action activists of the last few years. Not all of them. Some of the Extinction Rebellion stuff directed towards public transport, I was a bit like, okay, why are you coming for working class people's trains? But I think not just Gen Z, but like lots of young people who are so activated by this issue and who truly understand the urgency of it, and who are trying to force older generations and the political class to take notice. I am very inspired by them and very disappointed that politicians aren't doing better for them. I mean, and I think the Rishi Sunak thing was just particularly ridiculous, given he made a big deal out of how much his daughters care about climate change, and it's the only political issue that, you know, they're really incensed about. And then, was quick to row back on all of this stuff. And so then it's like, well, if it's not because British people want it rowed back on them, presumably it's because of corporate lobbyists, right? In those of us who know, but like, who is it that's pushing us backwards on climate when it is so urgent that we move forwards?
My under the radar this week is the election to the mayoralty of Derry of Lilian Seenoi-Barr, who is Northern Ireland's first black mayor and the third, I think, black mayor ever in Ireland. Lilian is a refugee from Kenya, where she worked on gender rights and against female genital mutilation. The work became somewhat dangerous and she had to leave. So she's a refugee who has come and thrived, clearly, and has now been elected to the mayoralty of Northern Ireland's second city. And before people in Northern Ireland and elsewhere get too self-congratulatory about what this says about them, she's had to navigate significant racism in doing this. There are a few things that I think are interesting here. One is, first of all, a sort of declaration of affiliation, I guess, which is that I have a brother who lives in Kildare. I go to Ireland often, usually Dublin and Kildare, but I spent quite a lot of time elsewhere. I used to live in Belfast. And so I've seen the way that Ireland has changed, particularly Dublin, but not exclusively. That, you know, my brother used to say when he first arrived in Dublin, which would have been in the sort of early 90s, I'd say, around that time, rice was in the ethnic food section.
Oh, well, my Welsh granddad famously considered rice an ethnic food and for that reason would not eat it.
And that being black there was a curiosity, you know, and I experienced it. I remember a guy in a pub saying, we're not sure if this man has come all the way up from Africa for a pint of Guinness and he's been waiting for an awful long time. And there was this sense, apologies for the accent, it didn't work for everybody, no disrespect intended. So I am somewhat familiar with the situation in Ireland. And it did go from that, people in a pub saying, you know, well, this man's come all the way from Africa for a pint of Guinness, to I have been shouted at. I've had people shout the N-word in the street at me out of a van. And my brother talked about how when he kind of first came, there was this kind of exotic presence that he would have. And then after a while, people just assumed he was Nigerian. And that, you know,
reason it was Nigeria specifically, or
well, it's the biggest country in West Africa, and so you know a lot of
also people, they bloody love Guinness. Did you know that Nigerian Guinness 7%? It's 7%, Gary. It's 7%.
That is.
You can get it in certain establishments in the UK. I'll hook you up.
So, but what we have seen in Ireland in recent times, and coming up to the Euro elections, is this significant increase in far-right slogans, in anti-immigrant sentiment, slogans like Ireland is full, which is, given that Ireland still hasn't, population-wise, it still has a lower population, actual population, than it did before the famine. So it's a rare event in a Western country. I don't know of another Western country like it, where its population still hasn't recovered from then, which is partly about the famine, but then partly about the massive amounts of emigration that there's been from Ireland. So Ireland for the Irish. Imagine if the Americans had said that to the Irish. They kind of did a little bit, but a lot of the Irish got in. Imagine the Australians or the New Zealanders or the Brits would say that to the Irish. Once again, the Brits kind of did say that, but lots of Irish people came anyway. That there is this interesting disconnect between the history, the very recent history of migration in and out of Ireland, and the presence and arrival of newcomers. And I commend to the listeners a very interesting book by a guy called Noel Ignatieff called How the Irish Became White, which is about Irish people going to America leaving this space in Ireland where they were occupied, colonized, less than, and moving to America and realizing that even though there was significant anti-Catholic prejudice and there was lots of prejudice against Irish people, with a slight shift in the way that they thought of themselves, they stopped being primarily Catholic people and they became primarily white people in a country where there were other people that you could beat up on.
The way that whiteness is and has not been a fixed category is a very, really interesting topic and probably one we should do on another podcast. Yeah. In terms of Lilian, though, which is very good news, very happy for her.
Yeah, well done, Lilian.
Congrats, Lilian. I feel like sometimes we have a difference on how much representation matters in politics. And I think I often lean more towards it brings me joy to see black and brown people elected. And you tend to be more skeptical. So I'm intrigued to hear a bit more on that.
We can see that there is a model of diversity, and here I'm going to quote Angela Davis. I did an interview with her, big name drop, and she said, there is a model of diversity in these times where it's a difference that makes no difference and a change that brings no change, of having different coloured hands on the levers of power, but they're doing the same things with it. And so I am wary of great claims about what these things mean. But I think that it's interesting that it happens. When it happens, it is interesting. And so when I talk about her, it's because, first of all, Ireland is a place that I've been interested in, and its kind of racial dynamic as a overwhelmingly white country that has been colonized. And, if you look at its role in prosecution of Israel, for example, or in a range of other things, then you can see that historically there is something of that legacy there. On the other hand, police in Derry arrested a 30-year-old man on suspicion of harassment and threats to kill because Lilian was elected. So I do think there are limits to representation. I also think representation is important. I guess that's where I'd stand. So that's all for this week. Thanks so much for joining us.
And if you want to stay in touch with us, you can follow us on social media at over__pod_, or sign up to our amazing newsletter at overunderpod.com.
Thanks for listening to Over the Top, Under the Radar.